Hello, and welcome to Reunification for the School Community Lessons Learned in Reunification and Recovery. My name's Michele Gay, and I'm Executive Director and co founder of Safe and Sound Schools. And reunification is one of the things that I am most often asked to talk about, answer questions about, and present on. So I'm excited to share my own lessons learned with you as a teacher, as a parent, but also to share some of the great resources that are out there for schools and communities. There are some really great resources that we'll be referring to throughout this presentation, and as well, of course, a lot of personal and lived experiences to draw upon. So before we get started, just a little background on this workshop. It's typically a one-day, full-day training that Dr. Melissa Reeves, and I developed. There are multiple modules that are part of the training, as well as some hands-on kind of scenario type activities. But what we're going to do today is just provide kind of a quick overview or primer on reunification itself and share some of the resources that we draw upon in that training. So plenty more to dive a little bit deeper into with you another time. But today, hopefully enough to just kind of whet your appetite and get you started with these conversations in your own community. What I'm going to share with you is coming mostly from Module 2, Defining Reunification and Defining Best Practices in Reunification. I'm going to start with some hard truths, some basic truths about reunification, kind of set the table for us. One of the things that we often hear a lot about from our schools and districts when it comes to reunification is that, you know, it's optional, right? We don't have to plan for it. Or it's maybe something that we'll get to later. The truth is that few districts even require reunification procedures at this point. It's frequently ignored in terms of emergency planning in schools and communities, and I think that it's not because schools and communities don't care or don't value the importance of reunifying families and children after there's been some type of school-based crisis. It's often more so that they're thinking it's somebody else's job. Certainly authorities, law enforcement, maybe even emergency planners in the community. So there is a lot of confusion regarding who's responsible for this process. We know, unfortunately, though, a poorly executed reunification plan can be really harmful. It can be the source of a lot of chaos in the community. And unfortunately, we know that reunification is something that follows an actual crisis or emergency. So with that kind of chaos and confusion already in the air, a poorly executed reunification plan can only add to that. And that leaves us in a position where there's a risk of secondary trauma. That risk increases with the duration and the complication of that reunification process, really kind of underscoring the point, the importance of making sure that we have solid plans in place before there's ever a crisis. And last but not least, of course, many of our children in schools are young children. They're all minors, well, almost all minors. And we know that young children, minors, children with cognitive delays as well, are children that are going to be at greater risk for that risk of secondary trauma in these events. So some difficult truths to confront, but some realities for sure about reunification. As we dive a little bit deeper, I want to point to 4 primary sources that we use for this reunification training that we've developed at Safe and Sound Schools. One is the Readiness and Emergency Management for Schools guide of developing a family reunification annex. I know, lots of words, but the REMS TA website from the United States Department of Education really does contain an awful lot of great resources and guidance for you. As well, the U.S. Department of Education and multiple other agencies joined forces to create the Guide for Developing High-Quality School Emergency Operations Plans. And in that guide, you will find some good best practices and essentials for reunification as well. The National Association of School Psychologists Prepare Training Program has some phenomenal resources and templates and a lot of great best practice guidance for reunification that does a wonderful job of really bringing mental health and wellness into the planning process. And then last but not least, the standard reunification method from the I Love You Guys Foundation is available online at the I Love You Guys Foundation website as well. All of these resources are available to you online for free. You can get on and download these resources. The standard reunification method, or the SRM, from I Love You Guys, has a lot of very practical sort of plan in a can, materials ready for school safety planning teams to come together and just get to the work of planning. And they've done a great job planning it down to some very extreme details. So lots and lots to get started with. And of course, plenty more out there. Lots of the schools and communities that we work with have developed their own reunification plans, and many of them, as you know, are willing to share those. So lots of folks that you can draw upon as you get started on this work, or look to revamp or examine your own school reunification plans. So let's talk about the preparedness missions. I referred to the Readiness and Emergency Management for Schools website that the U.S. Department of Ed hosts for all of us who do this work. And REMS has defined these 5 critical areas, or these preparedness missions. These missions are what many of us refer to as the emergency management cycle. Of course, prevention is where we would all like to be. We would like to be able to prevent crisis, prevent tragedy, prevent any kind of harm that might befall our schools and communities. So we spend a lot of time in the prevention area, but we cannot prevent everything. So mitigation is another important mission that's a part of this cycle. If we are not able to prevent a crisis, what can we do if it begins to unfold to mitigate the damage, the trauma, the pain, the loss? And during a crisis, what can we do to protect people, to keep them safe as we possibly can? And what can we do as a community of responders and a community of planners to best respond to those needs? And ultimately, of course, what can we do to recover the community? This, unfortunately, is where many communities spend most of their time. Recovery takes a very long time, although a crisis can be over in minutes. Recovery is something that for many lasts a lifetime. So it's important that when we discuss these types of things, particularly reunification, we're discussing them in the context of our preparedness missions, and that we're also thinking about basically the before, during, and after of an emergency. That's a helpful way for us to be planning, thinking about all of these important parts of the cycle. A little bit more on those annexes. I didn't choose the wording annexes, functional annexes. This definitely comes from emergency management world. I, as you know, am an educator by trade, but this is the official language that we use, that REMS has put forward to help us in this planning process. So I like to think in terms of chapters as a former reading teacher. So these are the chapters that I think of in my plans when we're talking about school safety planning. These annexes or chapters or sections, these are the main areas that we need to be considering. One, of course, is evacuation. Do we have plans in place for emergency evacuations? Do we have plans for shelter-in-place type incidents? Do we have plans for a lockdown procedure? And are we able to account for all persons in any of these circumstances? Are we able to communicate and provide warning to the community during one of these crises? Do we have plans for family reunification after the crisis? For continuity of operations when there has been some type of disruption, say natural disaster, interruption of power, loss even of school buildings and facilities. Recovery as well, I talked about. Do we have plans in place for recovery? A lot of communities think of recovery as something you sort of feel your way through, and unfortunately that is partially true. But when there are plans in place for this annex or this chapter, we know that our communities and our individuals can fare much better. Do we have plans in place for security throughout all of these circumstances and procedures? And of course, what are the public medical and mental health plans that we have in place? What can we do to ensure that everyone's medical health and mental health are considered and supported during these types of situations? And one more annex that's recently been added is behavioral threat assessment and management. So that's another whole presentation. But just to kind of give you an overview of those essential functional annexes, it's important that we do that because, as you will see through this presentation about family reunification or school-based reunification, a lot of these annexes will come into play. So we're going to start with the emergency operations plans, talking about the functional annexes that support reunification. Of course, the reunification one, squarely, and communications and warning are also going to come into play. Accounting for all persons, that means do we know who is in the building on the campus? Do we know everyone's whereabouts? Evacuation, naturally, and of course, security. So these are the 5 critical annexes that are going to come into play as we talk about reunification today. When we sit down to plan, there are some essential rules of the road, if you will, that can be really helpful for us to consider. Before we even get started, it's really critically important that we as a team or as a school community have been able to garner leadership support. The work of reunification it's big. There are a lot of things to plan and account for, and there are a lot of kind of jobs to do, a lot of resources to compile, and that's really difficult to do if we have not been able to get our leadership on board. So it's really important that teams do spend time educating leadership, school-based leadership, superintendents, school boards, and the like of the importance of reunification and planning on a beautiful blue sky day. We also want to make sure that we're thinking about customizing our plans to the site level. Of course, we have to start somewhere. Many of our schools and districts look at planning from a more global or district level, and that can be a good place to start. But the idea is that we are able to develop site-specific plans for each individual school or educational facility within that area or district. We also want to make sure that we are looking at all hazards. What are all the different things that might make us have to engage that reunification plan? I think a lot of school communities and a lot of people in general, when they think of reunification, they're thinking of reunification being preceded by something like an act of violence or a school shooting, for example. That seems to be when reunification gets most of its attention. We'll see on the news footage of students and teachers evacuating or moving to a family reunification site, and that seems to be how most people are thinking of reunification as a result. But the reality is that reunification procedures and plans can come into play and often come into play more often around other different types of hazards. For example, a gas main leak, water, flooding, all different types of things that render a school site unsafe for students to remain in. So it's important that we're considering lots of those different hazards. We also need to consider very carefully the access and functional needs of the whole school community. Access and functional needs, again, not verbiage that any educator came up with, but what it really means to most of us is special needs. So individuals who might have any kind of barrier to accessing safety and being able to function in the environment safely, that's what we're talking about. On a routine basis in schools, access and functional needs refer to an individual's ability to access the building itself, the facility itself, to access information, to communicate. Those would be some kind of everyday examples. And of course, during a crisis, access and functional needs are going to become even more important because we're thinking about an individual's ability to access and function in the middle of a crisis situation. So we're looking at individuals who might be in a wheelchair, who might be in crutches or be temporarily disabled with a boot, for example. We're also looking at individuals who may be nonverbal, may be autistic. Perhaps they don't speak English yet. These would be potential barriers to safety in one of these reunification scenarios. So we want to be very carefully considering the variety of different special needs, if you will, that might exist in our community. And of course, we need to account for all different settings and all different times. For example, during or outside the school day, on or off campus, because these types of crises that befall our school communities, they seldom do so during a convenient time. It's often during passing times or arrival or dismissal, days when there might be a field trip. All of those things are important things for us to be considering as we look at a school's ability to reunify students and families following a crisis. And last and surely not least, we must be following a collaborative process. If you haven't already picked up on it, reunification involves a lot of people. It involves a lot of planning. It involves a lot of cooperation. And that simply won't work unless we have established a truly collaborative process as a community. Now, equality reunification involves lots of things as well. So looking ahead to what we'd like it to look like, ideally, it involves a multidisciplinary team and it involves community collaboration. That multidisciplinary team is the only way to successfully tackle something as complicated as important as reunification. So really making sure that we have individuals on that planning team, on that response team, on that larger reunification team that have school-based mental health background, that have school leadership background, that are educators, that have law enforcement or school resource officer experience and perspective, that we have some parent involvement, some student involvement. We want to hear from a lot of different perspectives, and we certainly want to be looking through a variety of lenses as we are planning for this complex of a process. And of course, that involves an awful lot of community collaboration. We've all got to be playing on the same team. The quality reunification is part of a comprehensive safety and crisis plan. I think a lot of people are tempted to look at all of these plans and think of them kind of in isolation. It's really important that in all things we do school safety, we are looking to knit it all together so that something like reunification relates to a lockdown procedure or relates to a fire emergency plan. All of those things have to be able to kind of seamlessly work together in times of crisis in a school community. So it's definitely part of a comprehensive safety and crisis plan. It's not the only plan, and it's not an option, something that can be done later. It's an important piece of that holistic and comprehensive safety and crisis plan. It also needs to align with ICS, the Incident Command Structure, which I'll admit for educators like me sounds like somebody else's language. But the reality of incident command is that it is a structure that most of us can understand if we just take a little time to review it and become familiar. We don't all have to be experts in that command structure, in understanding the ICS roles, because in fact, many of those roles will be filled by public safety professionals, law enforcement, emergency managers, and even district level personnel. But we do really all need to understand our role within that structure and understand that there is a pretty specific division of labor, of roles, and responsibility. So when we look at something like reunification, it's really important that we are understanding it as very much a part of an emergency management process, which relates, of course, to incident command structure. We want to make sure that the quality reunification is one that incorporates the US DOE guidelines that I referred to at the beginning of this presentation and the most current resources that are out there. These essential resources, these primary resources that I shared with you are but a few that are out there, and they are continually being updated. So I encourage you, if you put your reunification plans together and you used all of those resources, but you did it maybe 5 years ago, to go back and look and see how these things have evolved and have been updated, because they are ever changing. People are always providing tweaks and changes and feedbacks as we are all learning in our own communities. Quality reunification also reflects that process, that continual process of changing and updating, of planning, of preparing, of practicing, and providing staff and student development. It's an education process, it's a learning process, and it's one that can serve our schools, our communities, and all of our community members, not just when they are on school grounds or in the school building, but also out in the workplace, out in the house of worship. These are kind of basics of putting people back together in a safe and organized way that can be utilized anywhere in the community. And last but not least, it's really very important, especially to us at Safe and Sound Schools, that when we plan reunification, we are putting a lot of emphasis on mental health. The point of reunification is obviously to get people back to their people safely and expeditiously. But there's one more really important piece of that, and making sure that everyone is well, that their mental health and wellness are as protected as they possibly can be during the process, because we know that handing people off to their family, their loved ones, we want to be able to do that in a way where they are physically safe and they are also psychologically safe as well. The reality is, and I think this quote kind of sums it up beautifully. It's from my co-founding partner, Alyssa Parker, who lost her beautiful daughter, Emily, at Sandy Hook School. She says, "A positive reunification is the start of the recovery process for our students, our teachers, our families, and community." And this is something that she and I learned very much firsthand, based on our experiences following the tragedy at Sandy Hook School. Waiting for a very long time in the midst of a lot of confusion and chaos and misinformation and lack of information. We know firsthand how traumatic that can be for family members who are, waiting for news of their loved one. So making sure that we plan for this is how we ensure that it's a positive process. So what does it look like? Wow, it can look like a lot of different things. The reality is that the circumstances of the crisis that precede that reunification, they're going to dictate what the reunification looks like. So, for example, was it a fire emergency? Was it a natural disaster? Was it an act of violence? Is the building itself, is the campus itself a safe place? Or is it someplace that is very dangerous for people physically or even psychologically, and we need to get people out of there and move to a different location? Are there emergency responders and agencies on scene? Do they have their processes and investigations going on? Is there someone who's potentially violent on campus that they are dealing with? And of course, what is the capacity of the site? Most school buildings do a fairly good job of making sure there's enough room for students and staff, teachers, but is there enough room for all of those parents to be coming to the site? Is there room for all of the different responding agencies to be arriving on scene as well? These are all really important circumstances that really come into play depending on the type of crisis. So once we have considered the circumstances of the crisis, we can start looking at the different logistical models that are available to us as a school community for conducting that reunification. So, for example, there are three main logistical models that are known, that have been proven, that different school communities have utilized in the past. And those are on-site reunification. That would be where we are able to conduct a reunification right there on-site at that school or campus or educational setting, whatever it may be. There's another one that is a drive-through model where, family members are coming. They're never even getting out of their cars. They are driving through, kind of like the Chick-fil-A, to make their way through various stops and then ultimately be reunified with their loved one. That could happen on-site at a school or campus, and that could also happen at an off-site location as well. And then, of course, that brings us to off-site. I think a lot of people, when they're thinking of reunification, are imagining a full-blown reunification, which is off-site at another pre-staged location. We'll get into that. But the reality is there are a lot of different models, some much more simple, and some certainly a lot more complex and involved. But again, it goes back to the circumstances of the crisis in terms of what model we're going to choose. So let's talk a little bit about the on-site reunification considerations. We can utilize the on-site reunification model if our school site or campus is not ground zero. I'm going to give you an example of an experience that I had on 9/11 while teaching math in my third grade classroom. Word started coming from various staff members that there had been some type of terrorist attack on the World Trade Center buildings in New York City. This, of course, was really difficult to process at the moment, but as the day was unfolding, I realized that what we were experiencing in our school, in the Baltimore, Washington metropolitan area, not ground zero, was actually a reunification. What started happening in our community was when word of these attacks was starting to, ripple through our community, and then when that plane hit the Pentagon, where many of our, community members worked in D.C. and certainly with the government. That really had a profound effect on our community's reaction. So we had a lot of community members rushing school to get their hands on their kids or their loved one or their spouse. I think for many of us, the instinct was to go home, to try to get to safety and to try to get all of our loved ones with us. So that was very much the situation that we were confronted with, and we were not prepared for that by any means. However, our principal did have a reunification plan. So he was able to lock all of the perimeter doors of the school building. He was able to set up an intake station outside the front doors. He was able to man that with our secretarial staff. And he was able to begin using personnel that didn't have immediate charge of kids. Perhaps they were related arts teachers, they were cafeteria staff, they were a school nurse. And these people would fill the role of runner as parents were coming to sign their kids out. They were able to go retrieve that child after the approval process and reunify them right then and there on our school site. So that's an example of a reunification that could take place on site where the school itself is a safe place. It is not ground zero for the crisis. So that building, that campus, they're deemed safe. And it is also possible to conduct this on-site reunification without interrupting other emergency processes. So there's no investigation happening, no crime has been committed on the school grounds, no incident has transpired or taken place. So we're not interrupting or potentially exposing children, teachers, and families to the work of our public safety or emergency responders. We also, in this instance, would be able to secure the location, just like my principal did. We were able to restrict outside access very simply and easily by locking perimeter doors and then setting up an intake table or station outside of the school. It's kind of similar, very similar in many ways to an unscheduled early dismissal. So we were able as a school to kind of fall back into some of the familiar routines of signing children out, like we would use on sort of a field day where lots and lots of parents, after the majority of the festivities are done and all the activities, they'll start, signing kids out. So we were able to kind of fall back on those procedures there. And then, of course, and most beneficially for us, students were able to remain in the classroom. I kept my kids with me in the classroom. I kept them busy. We had different activities that we could do. I had sort of a variety of different games to keep everybody busy and protected from the news and what was going on out in the world, so that when they were reunified with their family members, they were able to take in that news in the protection and safety of the home with their family. So that's a little bit of a kind of an overview of how an on-site reunification might take place and what those considerations might be. Off-site reunification is another different animal. It's a completely different animal. In this kind of scenario, we have to be considering accessibility for all students and parents. If we're going to move the students and staff to another location, accessibility is at the top of the list. Can people get in and out and move fluidly to different locations within that site with full accessibility? Is it, are there ramps for wheelchairs? Are the doorways wide enough? Those types of things are really important considerations. Parking, security, and traffic flow are also really important considerations here. As we learned firsthand at Sandy Hook, our offsite evacuation location turned into the reunification location. It was not supposed to be because it was not an area that had enough parking, certainly didn't have any security, and certainly did not have the ability to establish a proper traffic flow. So as a result, when all of those emergency vehicles came and then parents and community members came, you could not easily get in and out. Ambulances couldn't easily get in and out should someone need immediate medical care. So when we are thinking and planning ahead and looking at where we could conduct a reunification properly and safely, we want to make sure that we're considering parking capacity, the ability to secure the location, keep out community members until such time as it is appropriate to bring the right people in for that process, and to be able to manage that traffic flow. We also need to be considering the media staging area. Media will be part of this process. It is a reality. We recommend that you recognize that and plan for that as part of your process. So where will you place the media? Is there an appropriate staging area where they can come and they can do their job and report, working with you, not against you, and not be in and about, kind of in the mix where vulnerable students and families and staff might be. We have to think, too, about our ability at this offsite location to move students and parents to various points. I think a lot of people think we're just going to corral everyone together in a kind of a large area and we'll just, release them as we can. Well, that gets really challenging and difficult. It's hard to hear. It's hard to communicate. And we know that there can be a potential for trauma contagion when people are in a large group. It's a very emotional time as well. So we want to be able to move students and parents to various areas, if you will, to receive perhaps mental health support, to receive first aid, to participate in an interview with law enforcement for a variety of different purposes, and ultimately, of course, to a designated location where they can be reunified. We also have to think of the communication capability of our location. Again, something that we learned firsthand at the fire station where our reunification just sort of happened close to Sandy Hook School after the tragedy. We didn't have enough outlets. We didn't have, spare chargers for people's phones. Most people arrived thinking that they were going to kind of come and go. But of course, many of us were there, for the whole day, into the evening, even into the night. So we want to make sure that we have electrical capacity, communications capacity, internet backups, and those types of things. We also want to make sure that as part of that traffic flow, with people coming and going and moving people to different areas of the location, that we have sufficient separate entrances and exits. Can people come and go smoothly and fluidly? So just like we want to consider traffic flow on the site with cars and people, we have to consider that as well within the building itself. We're trying to reduce crowding. Like I alluded to just a little while ago, putting a lot of very vulnerable, potentially traumatized, frightened people together in one crowded area is not a recipe for supporting mental health. So we would like to be able to reduce crowding to the potential that we can. Is there a place that we can kind of break people up into smaller groups? Avoid some of that bottlenecking and those types of things that on an ordinary day would be inconvenient and might cause people to grumble. But in some traumatic circumstances can cause some pretty emotional blow-ups and some traumatic events. So one last thing to consider too with the offsite reunification is that ideally we would keep that at least a few miles away from the crisis scene. And kind of like I described earlier, with our offsite evacuation location, the firehouse, situated very close to Sandy Hook School, it was convenient for children and teachers to evacuate to that location, but it was not far enough away to protect family members arriving, community members arriving from all of those emergency procedures. There was an awful lot going on with police, obviously, with emergency medical folks, with emergency managers. And so those processes, we want to keep those separate for a variety of reasons, to protect those processes, to protect those people, and also to provide for a more calm reunification process altogether. So let's talk about the drive-through. This is one that some communities haven't considered, didn't maybe realize that it was a possibility, and yet it's one that they're engaging in a variation of, probably on a day-to-day basis. Many of our schools and communities have a car pickup line, right, at dismissal time or drop off. Some of our schools and communities don't even utilize busing services. Charter schools, private schools, they may be primarily conducting arrival and dismissal through a car loop, if you will. Certainly lots of schools have experience with a bus loop. But what we're doing here with the drive-through model is we're looking at leveraging that existing process that people may already be familiar with. In fact, lots of schools have got this down to a science. They use little placards inside the windshields to identify for staff as they're approaching who's getting picked up, who's cleared. So we're going to leverage some of those things in this same model. A lot of schools and communities began to lean into this during the pandemic to pick up materials, band instruments, lunches, meals, those types of things. A lot of our communities fell back into these familiar procedures to take care of those needs as well. It can be really beneficial because it can help to streamline the release process in many cases. We can do this kind of thing if the campus and the building are safe, or if it's an off-site reunification location that is safe, we can consider that drive-through model there as well. It can really protect parents and students from emotional stress. I was just talking about the need for breaking people up and reducing crowding. The drive-through model, when conducted well and when possible, can really help to do this as well, kind of keeping people in the confines of their own familiar vehicle, reducing that crowding, allowing people some quiet to be receiving information, to be on phone calls, to be doing things like that. It contains those parents as well. For all of those reasons, that can be really helpful and supportive. It can just kind of keep things moving in a very one-at-a-time way. But that can also be a challenge. It could be that this is not a model that can be considered in your school or community because of the number of parents and the number of cars. So we really have to think about the capacity of this site and our ability to create a loop or a traffic flow that is long enough to accommodate all of those cars. Another thing to consider if you're looking at this model is to allow parents or caregivers to be able to print or fill out their reunification card or form ahead of arriving. That can be a wonderful thing to give people to do while they're waiting to find out where that reunification is taking place. One of the most difficult things about any type of emergency circumstance that involves our kids in our schools is that waiting time. It seems like an eternity for parents. So if you're able to give parents something very productive to do during that waiting time that then expedites the process when they arrive on scene, even better. So that's something that you can consider, having those cards prepared, ready, downloadable, printable online. But all of this requires additional communication, a lot of extra signage, and a lot of support for parents waiting in that car line. We don't want people waiting without being touched, without being checked in on, without hitting the next milestone. Again, I'm going to refer to the Chick-fil-A line. They've done a beautiful job of streamlining a process with multiple checkpoints along the way. So at one station, one task is accomplished, and then people drive on to the next station to accomplish the next task, and so on and so forth. That can really help people in traumatic circumstances to have a feeling of progress, like they're getting somewhere. But of course, all of this takes a lot of practice as a community. Some communities practice this on a pretty regular basis. This is a familiar process to them, so they can lean into that. Other communities, this might be a totally new way of doing things. And so therefore, if you're going to consider something like this for your school or community, it's something you'll want to be sure that you practice and you familiarize people with. As I mentioned earlier, it takes a team to tackle a job this big. But it's really important that we're very thoughtful about the team that we select. It's not just any group of people that can manage a process like this and manage it well. So when we're looking at the team, we want to consider very carefully the overall characteristics of the team members. Not everybody is cut out for this kind of work. For example, if a team member is someone who is prone to be emotional or prone to be anxious or nervous, then perhaps this is not a team that they can serve on. Perhaps there's another role that they can support students and staff in. We also want to make sure that for everyone that we add to the team, there is a backup. There are substitutes. Just like we plan for redundancy in all things safety, we must consider that as well on the reunification team. Really, just like we would on any team, right? There's our first string, our second string, our third string, and so on and so forth. We would like to make sure that there is an in-house or site-based team, such as at an elementary school. There should be a in-house team and then also a district level team or a remote team that can support that in-house team if the reunification is of such a magnitude or involved or connected with circumstances that are such a traumatic event, it is likely that that in-house team will need support. So for example, when I talked about my elementary school in Maryland, when we conducted that reunification, we only needed our in-house team. The circumstances were such that we could put very simple plans and procedures in place and we could manage that ourselves. However, if there had been an incident in our school, if there had been something traumatic, if there had been an actual emergency at our school campus, then we would likely have needed support from the district to come in and provide for us. And of course, coordinating and practicing. I can't say practice enough. Practice with our emergency responders, with anyone who might get pulled in to help and support the school community in this type of event. We want to make sure, whether it's our sister schools, whether it's law enforcement, community-based mental health, anybody you think you might need to pull into this process or who might even, self-deploy to come and support, that coordination piece needs to be in place. So here's a little bit of a look at how you might structure your team. This, of course, is a little bit of an amalgamation of multiple different models out there that we have at Safe and Sound Schools kind of streamlined just to provide you kind of a general form, a general reference to look at here. So if you look at the dark blue boxes here in this org chart, those are more ICS roles. Those are those kind of leadership roles, the incident commander, the communications director, the mental health supervisor, the safety support, safety director or safety coordinator, the transportation director, however they are classified or named. These 5 key roles are roles that are likely going to be filled by district level leadership or public safety personnel that you are going to be coordinating with, and of course planning far, far in advance of any type of reunification event, ideally. The red box is that reunification lead. I'm going to refer to that. I'm going to use my principal again as an example. My principal at the elementary school on 9/11 took that position as reunification lead. He did not interface directly with any of our community members or even our students. He was very much in that lead kind of supervisory role of the process. Now, all of those other people in those navy blue boxes as well would not likely be interfacing with community members. So these are all very much leadership roles. But when you look at these lighter blue boxes, these I'm going to refer to as your worker bees. These are the people that are sweating. They are running back and forth from place to place or entertaining kids or greeting parents or even happily releasing students to their caregivers. But they're moving around a lot. They are doing the heavy lifting of the reunification itself. And so some of these are staging folks, people who set it all up, the greeters, the check-in folks, those runners going all over the building to deliver communication or children, supervisors of students, and of course, those who release students. So I'm going to take you through each of those roles in a little bit more depth, and I'm going to do it in two sections. So this first section of roles, these are those folks that were in those dark blue boxes, that kind of leadership role. These folks are not necessarily directly involved or working with or in contact with parents and students, but in some cases are because of their process. So, for example, the student accounting and release person, this is how the National Association of School Psychologists terms this role. In the diagram that I just showed you before, that was just the student release is what it was called. So it kind of depends which model you're looking at and what you decide to call this role. But this is the student release point. So the person who serves this role, or the people who serve in this role, they are receiving those torn cards or those approved reunification forms. They're cross-checking names. They're checking for accuracy before that final release. There's also the mental health supervisor who's providing mental health supports to student, staff, and parents, providing that intervention support and maybe arranging for caregiver trainings after the fact. And when I say that they're providing this support, they are not directly providing this support. They are gathering resources. They are planning for those supports, making sure those supports and those people are in place to provide these supports. Transportation is a role that is encompassing any transportation arrangements, transportation to off-site reunification locations, trying to transport individuals from a location in the building to another location, perhaps in a wheelchair, anything related to transporting people to a position of safety or that reunification location, getting them there, that's going to fall under that kind of transportation coordination role. Communication's a really important one. Communication is a role that's filled to help develop and distribute that critical messaging to the community and to the media. Also considering communication to community members, parents, caregivers who have come to be reunified with their loved one, their child. They need very specific communication and updates as well. So there's a lot involved in communication, as well as transportation and mental health, obviously. And then, of course, safety. Whoever is kind of supervising safety in this leadership role is monitoring the process for safety and security issues, troubleshooting to maintain the safety of all students and staff and families. Safety, of course, the whole point of this is to make sure that everybody is physically and psychologically safe. But that means that we want to protect that location. We want to protect vulnerable students and staff from lots and lots of people who will be showing up just to find out what's going on or to snap pictures or to get an interview. Many of those folks will be coming to be of help. But that can, of course, present some safety risks and challenges as well. So safety is another one of those core leadership areas there in those dark blue boxes, if you will, on the flow chart. So moving down into the rest of the flow chart, the lead, like my principal, guides the setup, substitutes positions, maintains the flow of the whole thing, troubleshoots as necessary, provides that kind of final accountability. The buck stops there. Communicates with staff and reunification team members, really just supervises the whole thing. And then a lot of those worker bees, we've got the staging and supplies folks. These are the folks that are going to set up your stations, your signage, make sure everybody has all the supplies that they need. The greeters are going to be that familiar face that welcome parents and caregivers, direct the media to where they need to go, look to establish interventions such as mental health support that might be necessary, and provide assistance as needed. Check-in is just what it sounds like. That's where our caregivers and our parents will come first. So those check-in folks are going to examine IDs. They're going to check those reunification cards and forms. They're going to cross-reference and do their due diligence. And once they have, then they direct individuals to the next station. The runners, as I said, they're going to work up a sweat because they're going to be running all over the place. They are retrieving and escorting students as needed. They're pitching in wherever needed. They're delivering supplies, communications, messages, all sorts of those things. And of course, student supervisors are essential. These are the folks that are going to keep the students safe and organized. They're going to be monitoring the students for any necessary interventions or support. They're going to keep everybody entertained, and they're going to keep everybody busy. This was the role that I filled in my school. I was a student supervisor. So I'm going to share with you now this wonderful video. It's a little old, but it's a good one. It was developed by the Adams 12 5-star schools. It's available for you on YouTube. It's there for everybody to take a look at and utilize in your own community's training. But it provides you a nice picture of what a reunification could look like. Now, remember, I have shared with you a couple different types of terminologies for different roles and different ways and models of doing this. What you're going to be looking at in this video is an off-site reunification that was taking place. So it's kind of that traditional model of reunification, and you'll see kind of how the flow and the process goes. So I'll give you a little while to look at that, and I'll see you on the other side.
The safety of students and staff is essential for a productive learning environment. Parents and guardians want to know their students are in schools well prepared for all types of situations. One important aspect of school preparedness is having a well-designed plan for student-parent reunification in case of an emergency. There are many reasons a school might use a planned reunification process. A water main break, a possible gas leak, or other types of situations may happen that would require formal parent-student reunification. This video offers guidance to help schools and districts develop an internal team of experts who can lend support during the reunification process. One important item to have ready at all times is a reunification go bag. At the very least, even if reunification training is minimal or hasn't been done, the equipment in this bag will be helpful in any reunification. Items include safety vests, sunscreen, food, water, and reunification job duty cards, which we will look at in more detail later. Other options include radios and signs. You may find more details about the Reunification Go Bag in the additional resources provided with this video. Another important step to be completed ahead of time is to provide reunification team members with specialized identification or a badge. This will help security and law enforcement know who is allowed to assist at the reunification. Next, we'll review the basic job functions that need to be done during a reunification. The lead guides the setup, fills positions, confirms readiness of each position, makes the decision on when to send messages to parents, maintains flow and communications, troubleshoots, and has final accountability of the scene. It's best if people serving as greeters are familiar to parents. They greet parents and guardians, assist in connecting people with support counselors when needed, and help parents fill out information cards. Runners serve a flexible utility function and often run errands and help with communications. Gatherers focus on gathering students to a designated waiting location, organize classes of students, do basic checks for student well-being, and direct students to support when needed. A checker checks IDs, checks completed information cards, and directs parents and guardians where to go next. Reunifiers greet parents at the reunification area. They get the information cards from the parents. Reunifiers then locate the students and bring them to the reunification point. They check with the student to make sure they are comfortable leaving with the adult before releasing them. Accountants assist the lead in tracking the situation as events unfold. They might contact school staff for information, assess torn information cards, cross-check names, or help maintain accuracy. They might also keep track of who is currently interacting with emergency responders or who may need assistance. They should often check in with the scribe. The scribe remains in a central location and writes down notes of all major developments as they unfold, and at what time they happen. For example, this might include when the automated phone call was sent to parents or when a student is meeting with emergency responders. Finally, entertainers manage the student waiting area. They may provide entertainment like short video clips or activities for students. They may also assist reunifiers as they locate students. For more detailed information on the duties of each function, please see the additional reference materials. Each reunification situation will have unique circumstances, like the number of staff available, facility layout, and weather conditions. A great way to quickly and easily plan for the logistics of the reunification is to use a map of the school and the job-specific duty cards provided in the resources. This helps organizers visualize how to designate specific areas and where each person will be stationed. When a situation calls for using the reunification process, the members of the reunification team are alerted, usually through a group text message. Team members then respond to the message to let others know their availability. The reunification team will likely be directed to gather at a location near the reunification site. This allows the lead to make sure the reunification site is ready for the team's arrival. When team members get to the scene, they will want to make sure their specific reunification ID is easy to recognize. Lead security members should make a central check-in location for team members obvious. Otherwise, team members should look for security personnel to find out where to check in. Once the reunification team members have arrived, it is important to brief the entire team on the plans. This is when team members get vests and a copy of their duties outlined on the back of the job function cards used earlier. All logistical pieces should be in place and ready to go before calling parents and guardians. This is extremely important because as soon as parents are notified about the reunification process, they will arrive in minutes. Some may already be on site. It's difficult to make adjustments to the reunification process once it starts. The physical layout of the process is key to an efficient reunification event. Some main points to keep in mind are to keep the reunification area out of sight from the check-in area. This helps keep order in the process and it gives time to gather all the necessary information. Having a reasonable amount of distance between the check-in area and the reunification area keeps the process running more smoothly by spreading out the amount of people in any one location. Based on the nature of the situation and factors like the weather, this process can be performed outside or inside the building. It's important to have a smooth direction of flow and not cross paths of people or vehicle traffic. Much more detail about positioning of stations can be found in the additional reference materials. Before sending out the call to parents, the lead checks in with each group of team members to make sure everyone is ready. There may be some situations where one of your reunification team members needs to change their assignment. That's another instance when the job function cards are valuable. The site leader should assist and explain the changes in job duty, and the card is available for further guidance. If a position just isn't working out for a member of the reunification team, the lead should assess that situation and make adjustments as needed. As we mentioned before, the lead guides the reunification process and maintains flow and communications. Greeters welcome parents and guardians and may help out with the various initial stages of the reunification process. It is important to have a school administrator in this position if possible, or someone from the school whom parents will know. Runners are all-around utility helpers who keep an eye on flow, communications, and assist with whatever might need attention. A gatherer helps round up students and get them to their designated waiting location. Checkers make sure all the information on the reunification information cards is filled out and matches with the parent's identification. Accountants help the lead keep track of the various aspects of the process, like which students might be meeting with emergency responders, or if there are questions that develop during the process. Accountants should check in often with the scribe to share updates. even if there isn't anything particularly new to report. The reunifiers get the information cards from the parents, locate students in the waiting area, reunify the students with the parents, and confirm that the students are comfortable leaving with the parent or guardian. If a reunification is happening at the school, for example during an unscheduled early release, it is helpful to have school staff in this position, especially if students are staying in their classrooms. The scribe tracks all events as they unfold and should check in with the accountants for updated information. The entertainer manages the student waiting area and may provide entertainment or activities for students. They may also assist reunifiers to identify students. This is an optional position if you have enough staff. Keep in mind that you don't want to show full-length movies the kids won't want to leave. As noted earlier, further descriptions are available in the additional resources. During a high-intensity situation, some of these positions may be challenging for members of the team. If a team member is uncomfortable with their role, they should let the lead know as soon as possible in order to make adjustments. On-site communication is a necessity in a successful reunification. The team lead should update the team on the process, and team members need to update the lead on any developments. A recommended best practice is to use radios. Radios are by far the most efficient communication devices in these situations. If radios aren't an option, a team lead or runner will need to update the other team members in person. Phone and text message systems can easily get flooded and are often unreliable in situations like this. If possible, it's best to do a quick debrief after the incident in order to identify or address any outstanding issues and get timely feedback from the team. A more thorough follow-up may be conducted later. In conclusion, establishing a district-level team to help with a formal reunification process is a significant asset in these situations, and any planning and practice done ahead of time goes a long way to helping the process run more smoothly. We want to thank all parents, students, and staff who participated in this training event, and we want to thank you for keeping schools safe.
All right, so hopefully that video gave you kind of a sense of what it could look like, kind of that visual. So if a picture paints 1,000 words, then a video, I don't know, 1,000,000. It's very valuable and hopefully can be helpful in that education process for you and your school community. So as we think about that team, we are looking inward. We're looking at who's available to us kind of right then and there in our building, but we're also looking at who's available to us in the district or outside of the school building and campus itself. So this is a great opportunity, great exercise for you to take back to your school and community. Think about all of those roles that we laid out. Think about who would likely fill some of those leadership roles of incident commander, for example, communications, mental health, and who would be those worker bees, on site, setting everything up, the staging, greeting folks, the runners, the check-in, all of those roles. It can be really helpful to just kind of lay that all out, tabletop it, and have that conversation with your school, with your community. A lot of times when people are looking at reunification, it seems that you'll need an army to come in and conduct this in a truly safe and sound way. But when you go through this exercise, you sort of look inward and you think, we really do have a lot of human resources available to us here right on campus. So who would some of those people be in your community? Well, that brings us to the end of part 1 of reunification for the school community. We've got lots more to unpack in part 2. I'll look forward to seeing you there. Welcome back to part 2 of reunification for the school community. Let's dive right in. So we're gonna take a little glance, just a little review of the flow. As you saw in the video, there are 5 key touch points, if you will, in this process. Whether you're doing the on-site, the off-site, or the drive-through, there are these key stopping points. So the first, of course, is arrival. That's where signs and greeters are going to direct parents and caregivers to the parking and check-in, so they know where they're going and they know what they're supposed to do next. Then they arrive at check-in. That's where they're going to line up. They could line up however you have deemed most expeditious. So perhaps that's to last name. Perhaps that's according to grade level. Whatever you do, make sure that your signs are high up. Of course, when you have a large group of people kind of crowded in front of that check-in table, no one's going to be able to read any of the signage that might be on the front of the table. So think those things through. But that's where our parents come, our caregivers come, and they complete that reunification card or form. They're verifying with their ID or some other form of identification. And then from there, those parents and caregivers are directed or escorted to an area where they are waiting. Perhaps they are waiting for reunification. Perhaps they are being escorted to a notification area to receive word of where their loved one has been transported to a hospital, or to be notified, unfortunately, if there has been a death. The next stop in that process is the retrieval. So once parents are waiting for that reunification, then runners can go take that reunification card to the student holding area, whether it's a classroom, whether it's a larger, auditorium where there's a movie playing to entertain students. And then they will retrieve that student and bring that student to the release and reunification point. Once there, that final check is made. That's where IDs are double checked, students are signed out and released, and reunification cards are checked, finalized, and retained for records. So that's just kind of the basic, at a glance, review of this process. Couple different ways to look at it. We talked about how flow is important, whether it's the flow of cars arriving or the flow inside of your actual reunification. We want to be thinking about, it's all about moving people. So we want to be thinking about how we can do that in the most efficient way, reducing crowding. So here are a couple different examples. I'm going to show you this one first of how you might lay out your reunification. Being an elementary school teacher, I did a lot of work with my math students using manipulatives. They're just things, blocks, cubes, a variety of different things that help our students process math, lay things out, build things, and so on. You can kind of use the same principle here, whether it's with Post-its, whether it's with physical chess pieces, however you want to lay it out. But it can be really helpful to do that over top of your school map, for example, to think about where you'd like to situate these particular critical areas as you're laying out reunification. So one of those areas would be an interview room. There is a potential, if there is an incident where a crime has transpired, or whether there has been significant injury, or a process needs to be examined, where interviewing will be necessary. So a quiet, private place where authorities can interview students or interview staff members. Another room that is really important, and important that it be private and safe, is a notification room. This would be a place where family members might learn of the death of their loved one, or perhaps the injury of their loved one. We want them to have a protected, quiet setting for that information, where they can be adequately supported by school authorities, by mental health supports, and by police or law enforcement. Another area in the reunification to consider is an area dedicated to mental health and crisis support. There will undoubtedly be, in an emergency of any significant magnitude, the need to support students or staff who may break down, who may have witnessed something very traumatic, experienced something traumatic, or just be having an episode with anxiety or a meltdown about, a disruption in their routine, perhaps if it's a student who has autism. So we have to have an area where there is a designated place for that type of support. The student holding area can be, as I mentioned earlier, a variety of different places. It could be an auditorium, it could be individual classrooms, it could be the gym, but it is wherever your community has deemed it safe and best to hold students. I personally prefer, and we at Safe and Sound advocate as much as possible, keeping kids in smaller groups to the degree possible. Putting your entire student body together in one area is very difficult to manage, particularly when you throw crisis on top of that. So as much as possible, if we can be keeping students and staff in smaller, separate areas, it'll be a little bit easier to support them, to entertain them, to manage them throughout this reunification process. And then one more area that I advocate that you designate in your layout is a place for special needs support. So, for example, a student like my Josephine, who had autism, who would have been very anxious in an emergency or reunification, and be very disruptive and very busy. So is there a place where we can provide specialized support to individuals or students who might need that? One place that's great in many schools that serve students with special needs, students with IEPs, students who need physical or occupational therapy, there's usually an OT or PT room in the building. If not, there's likely a gym. And those places tend to bring comfort to a lot of our students with special needs. It's a place where most kids want to go. So those rooms can be very helpful for these purposes. Now you'll notice that there is a line between all of these boxes. So on the left side are all those areas that I was mentioning that we think of kind of as the protected spaces or the protected locations. These light blue boxes that you see, those are the areas where the community would be. Those are open, those are more public areas. So you'll see there's a media staging area. As we talked about before, it's really important that there be a place for media to go to do their job, but a place that protects vulnerable populations, arriving parents that may be emotional, students and staff members as well. You'll see that check-in area, that parent holding area, and that release point, that final release point, those are all kept separate from the areas that we're protecting where our students and staff are. And of course, you have your runners who are running around all of those different areas, ensuring that the process is taking place well. So here's another layout, another example of how you might do it. Sometimes reunification might take place outside, fully outside. Sometimes reunification is something that's happening because of weather or circumstances within the building or another building. So it really depends on the physical plant that you are dealing with or the campus that you have available to you. But this is just another way to look at how you might establish that flow and address these critical designated areas that are important to the process. So something that's also really helpful for you to do, another little tabletop activity to take back, as well as kind of thinking about your team, think about where you want to lay this out. You know, if you had to do a reunification at your specific school site, how might you lay out this flow? Acknowledging the need for all of these critical areas. And then, of course, think about this same exercise for your alternate locations. With reunification, we want you to have at least 3 possible locations to choose from. I know that's not always possible, but it's really helpful to think through the alternatives. And of course, some are better than others, some are more ideal than others. But again, it's your circumstances that are going to dictate what you need and where you need to go. A lot of folks, when they learn about reunification, parents, for example, maybe they've seen on the news of a reunification that took place after a crisis, they want to know, where is our reunification location? I want to know so that I can be there. I can be the first one there when there's been a crisis. That, of course, is problematic for a variety of reasons. First is, remember, our circumstances are going to dictate where the reunification needs to be. So there is not a one place where we should always be conducting this process. Secondly, we don't want parents arriving. We don't want community members arriving before we've had the opportunity to stage it, to set it up, to get kids in there safely. So it's really important that we do communicate to our community. We're not trying to be secretive. We're not trying to hold anything back. But the reality is that we don't know where that reunification location is going to be. Availability, circumstances, weather, a lot of different factors go into choosing that place. So a couple things to consider when you are setting up for success, wherever that reunification may be, and thinking it through according to those different locations. Want to make sure that we're using separate rooms or natural barriers to break that line of sight between groups of people. Example, parents might jump the line as they're moving through this sort of Chick-fil-A process, right? If it seems like there's a shortcut and I can skip from this step right to the step of getting my kid, I'm going to do it. So we want to make sure that we have kind of created lanes, if you will, bumpers to keep people moving in an orderly fashion and moving through all of those stations. Those separate rooms and natural barriers can also just help maintain order and calm with students and with parents and caregivers. It's just going to keep that flow happening, going to keep people moving and keep people calm. It's going to prevent parents of injured or missing students from viewing this constant happy reunification of other families that perhaps they're not going to get that day. I know firsthand that was a building and increasing anxiety for me as I was watching lots of other friends and neighbors find their child and leave with their child. And I was still there with other parents waiting for the same. So we want to make sure that we're protecting people from that additional stressor as well. It's also going to help us to contain all those critical areas that we discussed, the interview area, the triage area, the counseling area, and so on. And ultimately, it's going to serve to protect our victims and our victims' families. Those victims being any child, any student who may have been exposed to these emergency circumstances. And, even like our kids on 9/11, they were not necessarily classified as victims, but they were protected from potential trauma, learning about what was happening out in the world. So it's all about protection. As we think about the really difficult aspects of reunification, probably nothing is more difficult to think about or plan than the potential for having to deliver death or injury notification. The fact of the matter is, though, and again, I know this and many other parents know this as well, families of loved ones lost, we want to get people that information as quickly and accurately as possible. We don't want people left for long periods of time not knowing the whereabouts of their loved one, not knowing what has happened to their loved one. Every additional second of waiting and limbo, we know, has the potential to increase the risk of post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic stress itself exponentially. So it's very important that we're not avoiding that we're planning for it head on and that we're planning for it with a process. It's not going to be an easy process. There's no way to make that an easy process, but it's something that's really important that we do to honor the victims and to honor their families. So thinking about students who may have been injured or staff members who may have been injured, it's really important that we are planning to identify those individuals and record their location of transportation. So for example, if students have been transported to a nearby hospital to be treated for injuries, we must be able to immediately tell their loved ones, their caregivers, their family members exactly what has happened and where they have been taken. And we must also be able to support them in getting there safely. School personnel, whenever possible, we would like to be able to accompany any minors or students. Unfortunately, it is really difficult to sort of lose track of, where a student is transported after they leave the school, because once they're not at the school, they are now in the custody of emergency medical. And those processes can be really difficult to kind of get around in order to be able to communicate once the school no longer has custody and the family no longer has custody. As another personal example, I know that I was frantically calling the hospitals trying to get information about whether my daughter Josephine was at any of the area hospitals. And there was no one who was able to give me any of that information because of confidentiality reasons. So, thinking really carefully about ensuring that school stays involved in the transportation process can really help to support family and help them get critical information about their loved one as soon as possible. In these types of situations, law enforcement will typically take the lead, but it's critically important that when we're talking about a school-based crisis or school-based reunification, that we have the school represented and we have some mental health professionals represented as well. So we kind of want that trifecta to be there to support families. We want to have law enforcement, we want to have mental health of some kind, and we want to have somebody from the school there to provide support. In some cases and in some communities, it can be really helpful to have a member of local clergy that is there to support as well. It's important to think about a very private space, as I mentioned earlier, for this process, this notification process. It's an emotional one, and the potential for traumatizing other people to exposure of that process unnecessarily is something that we want to avoid when and if possible. We want to make sure that there are mental health supports available to folks. It's certainly not a moment for counseling, but it's a moment for support. When somebody is receiving this difficult news about the death or injury of a loved one or a child, they will need additional support. It is almost inevitable that some form of shock, some form of immediate trauma response will present itself. So it's important that we are preparing and planning for that. Assigning a primary contact or support person, kind of a liaison for the family, for the caregivers, is also very important. I know in our case, that person our law enforcement liaison ended up sort of defaulting to that position and becoming our primary contact and support person. But families really appreciate just one go-to to provide them follow-up support, to check in on them, to help connect them with resources for the ongoing recovery. So it's really important that someone is designated to each and every family member who has been affected. Providing age-appropriate resources and anticipating the reality that there will be younger siblings that will show up. There will be other family members that will show up. In fact, in many cases, depending on kind of cultural considerations, it may not just be one parent or two parents. It may be grandparents that are arriving. There may be, preschool-aged children, babies, and toddlers. So we need to be able to support the whole family that shows up and have appropriate activities and resources to support them and keep children busy and protected and away from some of these processes, but allow parents and caregivers the opportunity to receive the information and the support that they need as well. And then, of course, we've talked about this before. It's very important that we are protecting these vulnerable parents, caregivers, students, and staff members from the media who are coming to do their job and report and get information. But the priority is the wellness, the psychological and physical safety of our students, our staff, and our family members. So let's talk about what we have to pack and what we have to gather for this type of process. Depending on where you are in the world, where you are here in Tennessee, you'll need different things depending on the population that you're serving in your school community. But here are some of the basics that are pretty universally appearing on these kind of reunification go kit lists that we see. One thing that we recommend is that you consider having at least two identical kits, one at school and then one off-site. So, for example, you might have the need to reunify your school community. Everyone has safely evacuated, and now you can't go back into the building to retrieve all of the resources that you need for that reunification. In that case, it's going to be really beneficial if there's another reunification go kit, if you will, that is at your sister school or at your district office that can be brought to your reunification location. We also want to consider student medication plans. Communicate with the nurse, communicate with the district, communicate with other health providers, pharmacies available in case there is an incident where there's an extended period of time and a student needs medication. It's not available readily in the reunification go kit. Some essentials like the bullhorn, the PA, those can be really helpful in communication. So making sure that there's some ability to do that communication at your site. Reunification cards or forms can be really helpful. Just plan out ahead all of the critical information that you will want to collect to verify an individual before reunification. Put that on a card, make that available to your family members, familiarize them with that as well, long before there's ever any kind of crisis situation. Basics like clipboards, those can help folks as they're filling out those forms. Those can help your team members. There's not really going to be a desk available. This is very much a mobile process, so clipboards can be essential. Signs. I cannot say enough how important signs are to this process. Just guiding people, letting people know where various stations are, where various resources are, and where they should be. Safety vests for all of your team members are really helpful. It's helpful for the team to be able to spot one another, but it's also really helpful for family members, for caregivers, and for students to be able to identify who's in charge, who's running this process. It's also very helpful for first responders, emergency managers, all of those public safety folks that are going to be coming to help. They need to be able to identify who is in charge on scene. Basics like first aid kits, handheld radios, flashlights. We talk a lot about the children's emergency information and emergency procedure cards. Please make sure that you have them for staff as well. Are you able to identify multiple points of contact for a staff member, spouses, family members? Those are very, very important as well. So don't forget your staff members. Batteries, water, snacks, allergy-safe snacks, space blankets, again, depending on your location, your climate. The yearbook and student pictures can be really very helpful when trying to track down a student that appears to be missing. Can also be very helpful to the authorities when identifying victims. And pens and paper. You can't have enough pens and paper to support this process. So lots and lots of things to consider, but these are some of those that we see on a lot of the Go Kit lists that we see as kind of standouts as well. So let's talk a little bit about preparing the community before there's ever even a crisis. I alluded a little bit to the fact that you can prepare your community with the knowledge of this concept, that you can make those reunification cards available to them ahead of time. Preparing the community before the crisis can be one of the most beneficial things that a school community can do. Before there's ever even a crisis, the opportunity to teach people about this process, why we do it, how we do it, what their roles are, can really be a difference maker in terms of the success of getting students and families reunited safely after there's been a crisis. So in order to do that, we've got to provide the basic elements of the reunification plan. We don't have to give away the, trade secrets, but providing the basic concepts, defining the process for people, letting them just kind of understand what it is. And we can do that in a variety of different places. The school handbook, in many school communities, families have to sign off that they have received that school handbook, that they agree to the kind of rules and values of the community. So the school handbook can be one really great place for us to put this kind of information. Utilizing events like back to school night as well, where we have many of our community members coming in, where they're motivated to show up. Let's take a few minutes there to orient the community to these procedures and how we do them. Of course, there's always the school website. There are our social channels. There are a wide variety of different places that we can take advantage of to insert this information and begin preparing the community. What we're going to talk about in terms of the message and how we teach and prepare the community is really comes down to three things. We're going to be teaching families and caregivers that when there is a crisis and there is going to be a reunification, there are these three basic actions that they need to focus on. We need them to stay home or stay put wherever they are when they're receiving this information. We need them to stay ready and informed. So staying home until there are further directions for them to receive, staying informed via news and media and websites and robocalls, and staying ready, making sure your car you have enough gas, you have your driver's license, you have all the things that you will need. And so those three things, keeping it simple, but keeping it really clear, can be very helpful. I'm going to take this opportunity to show you another video, also from the Adams 12 5-star schools, that was created to orient the community to this concept of reunification and really teach the importance of those three basic actions that I just shared with you, the staying put or staying home, staying informed, and of course, staying ready. So take a look.
A school emergency can take many forms and may be due to weather, a power outage, hazardous materials, or a crisis at or near the school. Circumstances may occur that require parents to pick up their children in a formalized, controlled release. This is called reunification. Because a controlled release is not a typical end-of-school day event, a reunification may occur at a different location than your child's school. What part do you play as a parent or guardian? The role you play might be different than what you expect. In this 7-minute video, we will tell you why it's important to stay home and not attempt to come to the school, how you can stay informed about the situation, how you can be ready for reunification with your child. In a school emergency situation such as a tornado, fire, or crisis at or near the school, the most important contribution you can make to your child's safety is to stay home. We know your natural instinct as a parent or guardian is to come to school to protect your child, but by doing so, you may endanger yourself or your child. The school district and our first responders are working to control the situation and protect your children. Please don't come to the school. If you do, law enforcement or school officials might be distracted from the important task of keeping your child safe and managing the crisis and handling the emergency situation. You can help by staying home. In a school emergency situation, we want you to stay informed. We will provide information as soon as possible, but in some situations, accurate information takes time to verify and share. The school district will communicate throughout the emergency, and parents may be notified in a number of ways. The school may use its phone autodialer or text message system, or may contact you by email. The district website and local news media may also provide reunification information. It's extremely important that the school has your current phone numbers and email addresses. If your contact information changes, please notify your school. In some cases, students may be asked to send a text message to their parent or guardian. A reunification text message from a student may look something like this. The school has closed. Please pick me up at 3:25 at the main entrance. Bring your ID. You should not call or text a student's cell phone, as you may put the student at risk by doing so. Students and staff are taught to stay out of sight and be quiet. A phone ringing or vibrating could alert an intruder someone is close by. Additionally, please don't call the school, as you will be taking school staff away from the emergency situation. Ways you can monitor the situation include checking the district website, and checking local news media. How can you help? Keep your phone charged and close by. Stay informed by monitoring the district website and local news media. Here's what you can do to be ready and what to expect. In the case reunification is necessary, you'll be informed of where and when to pick up your child and what you need to bring. Parents and guardians will come to a reunification check-in location. Upon arrival, you will be asked to fill out a reunification card, show your photo ID, and then be reunited with your child. Remember, photo identification will be required at the reunification site.
Okay, I need to see your license.
Be patient. Reunification is a process that protects both the safety of the students and provides for an accountable exchange of custody from the school to a recognized custodial parent or guardian. Our number one priority is that students are safe and that they are united with their parent or guardian safely. Remember that this process takes time, and it's important to stay calm. What if a parent can't pick up their child? When a parent can't immediately go to the reunification site, the preference is to release students to those individuals who are identified as a student's emergency contact. Student self-evacuation. In some situations, students may evacuate themselves from the school. In this case, the student should notify their parent that they are safe. It is also imperative that the student or the parent notify the district. In this case, we may publicize a special phone number for this purpose. Remember, bring your photo ID. Be patient and remain calm. Try to send one adult rather than bringing other family members. Bring a pen or a pencil. In this video, we have told you why it's important to stay home and not attempt to come to the school, how you can stay informed about the situation, how you can be ready for reunification with your child. How can you help? Help us spread the word. Remind your friends and talk about your own emergency plans. Keep your information current by letting the school know if your phone numbers or email changes. Remember to stay home, stay informed, and be ready.
Okay, hopefully that video was really helpful in illustrating that for you. Again, it's available on YouTube, so you can access that video and share it in your school community. It's only about, 6 or 7 minutes long, so you can take advantage of back-to-school nights, parent-teacher conferences, those types of things. It's required viewing, as I would say, for our parents and our community members, and it can really help and support your community in the eventuality that you ever have to conduct a reunification. Communication is really important. How well we communicate before there's ever an event, how well we're communicating during that event, and how we are communicating after. We have a lot of things to consider when it comes to communication. Communication in many cases can make or break our success. We want that communication to be very efficient, and we want it to be very effective. We want to keep it simple, kind of like those 3 steps. Stay home, stay informed, stay ready. Keeping it really simple and concise. We want to consider internal communication and external communication. So how are we communicating internally at the school to staff and to students? And how are we communicating to parents, caregivers, and the community at large? How are we communicating to the media? We need to also consider technology barriers. Some families may not have internet, may not have access to a phone. What types of technology-related barriers, power outages, for example, might we be facing, and how can we work around those? Language barriers are another important consideration. Thinking about the fact that many of our school communities have members that don't speak English. Perhaps the families have just moved here from another country. Perhaps Parents don't speak English, students do. So we need to, factor those different things in and be ready to, stand up translation services, reach out to other resources, because how well we communicate with those families really comes down to our ability to support them and speak in their language in many cases. We have to look at media and social media. Again, how are we communicating to our media outlets? Are they delivering our message, or are they delivering a different message that they're receiving from unverified sources? Social media as well. Staying on top of that, designating someone who will own that social media messaging. We know now in this day and age that a lot of people are looking to social media. They're getting their news and their updates from social media almost exclusively. So someone or a team of individuals need to be there populating the messaging with real time, with updates, so that the community can trust and rely on your messaging from your community, your authorities. And while we're at it, let's make sure that that communication is something that the school, that law enforcement, and that public safety officials are channeling through one voice, making sure that that media message, that communication is consistent, and that it is all the same from all of these different agencies. We also want to consider communication to the community about short and long-term impact on activities. Depending on the severity of the crisis that precipitated the reunification, there may be sports that are canceled. School might be canceled for a period of time. School might be moved to another location. Those types of activities, a lot of our families and community members rely on those activities and that consistency, and can, in a very unexpected way, in the midst of some pretty severe circumstances, be very concerned, maybe even hyper-focused on, the impact of those types of regular, everyday activities. So something to consider. Communicating during the reunification, really keeping people up to speed on what's going on, is essential. So the first thing we want to consider when the crisis begins to unfold, as soon as possible, we as a school community need to communicate the situation. What has happened? What do we know? We can do that through those robocalls. We can do that through social media channels. We can even do that through student texts and staff texts. We have a lot of community members in the building that are going to have those cell phones, and they're going to use them. So it would behoove us to have a planned message that we can ask those individuals to text out to their family members. I'm okay. I am awaiting reunification. They're going to send out information at 10 o'clock. Some simple, consistent message that we can employ our students and our staff members to help us with. We also want to provide instructions for ongoing information. This is critically important. You want to keep people supported, you want to keep people calm, you need to continue to touch them with frequent updates. And even if you don't have new information, making sure that you are reaching out on that consistent basis with a regular cadence. You're using multiple channels, social, website, local news channels, all the different channels you possibly can think of that you can push that same consistent message out of. You want to provide that frequent and consistent update to folks, and you want to tell them the frequency that they can expect. Is it going to be every 30 minutes? Is it going to be on the hour? Whatever it is, they will come to expect that and rely upon that. And like I said, even if you don't have new information, show up for that designated update for folks, and it will go a long way. Encourage information channels other than calling the school. You will, of course, have people that will continue to call and call and call. And of course, everybody at the building is going to be very busy focusing on the needs of students and staff. And that's where we want them to be able to focus. So as much as possible, just reiterating to the community, please don't call us at the school. We are focusing on our children and on our staff right now. You can get your updates the following ways. We do want to also as part of trying to make sure that the messaging is consistent and accurate, develop scripts for those who are providing that outward communication. Put some thought into it as a team, as a group of agencies, put together what that script or that message is going to be and share that with multiple people who can push that out. We do not want individuals making up their own message, and we don't want them to be vulnerable to other people poking and prodding to get more. We want them to stick to that approved official message and continue to push that out. And of course, we want to prepare that reunification site well before we announce to the public, to the parents and caregivers, where that's going to be. That allows us the opportunity to get it all set up, to get our kids there safely, our staff members there safely, and then let our families know where they can come to reunify with their loved one. Accounting for all persons is that annex that refers to making sure we know everybody's whereabouts at any given point during this process. So that student accounting and release role that we talked about earlier often can actually be a team. It's so important that we're able to account for every student and every staff member that many school communities will not just designate one person in charge of this responsibility, but a team. There would be a team leader potentially, and there would be a couple of assistants perhaps, a student accounting specialist and a student release specialist. These are names that come from the National Association of School Psychologists Prepare curriculum. These folks together will ensure accountability. They will utilize class rosters, including absent individuals, folks who may have left school early, substitute teachers, itinerant staff, volunteers, even in some cases, delivery personnel. It's important that we are able to account for every single individual who may have set foot on our campus and be walking through that building when there is a crisis that takes place. Here are a couple examples of reunification cards or forms that you can find online. Many schools like to customize. You'll see the one kind of at the bottom of the screen with the little paw print. It's wonderful to be able to customize these forms to reflect the culture and the community that is, uniquely your school community. It also tends to be a little bit comforting to the community. It's a little bit of an official stamp that this is for your school, for your community, but it's something that they will recognize and in many cases appreciate because it's just reflective of your own unique culture and community. The common threads, of course, for all of these forms, basic demographic information, basic instructions, signatures. One thing that's really important to remind folks as they're filling out any forms or cards is to please print. Cursive in this day and age, boy, I actually used to teach cursive writing. It is not a thing anymore in our schools and communities, but some of the writing is just absolutely illegible unless it is printed. So we want to encourage folks to be careful, to take their time and print out this information in the most legible format possible. And once we have been able to obtain all of that information, we can look at custody verification. So those checkers that we talked about earlier, they will also have at their disposal, hopefully, a green list, a list of confirmed guardians, people that are approved. They are on the go list. There should be a photo ID, a driver's license perhaps, and that should match to that emergency card. There may also be a red list, a predetermined list of custodial restrictions and safety risks, such as perhaps a domestic situation. This is an important list to have predetermined and have at the ready for this process. And then there are some decisions to make in advance. For example, what are the checkers to do if somebody shows up who's on that red list? Who do they get involved? Who's there to support them in escorting that person off the premises? What will we do if a guardian shows up, a parent shows up without their identification? I guarantee it will happen. Some individuals will not even have an identification. Some will be reluctant to come if there is an identification process because we have parents, we have families in our schools and communities that are undocumented. So what's the backup there? How will we work around that to identify the appropriate family member for that child. What are we going to do about students who are 18 years and older? We have those students. Many of them have their own cars that they brought to school. What is our policy there? They may be permitted and they have the right to leave. So we have to think about that as well. We want to be able to tell their families that they have left. So there's got to be a process in place. And of course, as we talked about before, translation capability can be really important for our families who don't speak English. And in many cases, families who do speak English, but English is not the primary language or the first language, in times of crisis and trauma, communication and English skills, they can pretty quickly break down. So we want to make sure that we have thought that through. Very important. Some additional considerations: the crisis team, may be incapacitated, or perhaps they're still in lockdown during a school-wide evacuation and reunification. Sometimes these processes take a very long time. So what is our plan? What if that A team, as in our case, is not available to support this process? What do we do if a caregiver does not show up? What is the plan to support students who a family member does not show up for any given reason? How will we manage and support emotional parents and staff members during this process? What kind of supports, what kind of people, what kind of human resources do we need, and what kind of space do we need for that process? What do we do if our runners are unable to keep pace? What if this is going on for a long time? And, like I said, that's a very physical job. So how are we going to be able to consider backups and backups and backups for those folks? What do we do in terms of communication if cell phone coverage breaks down, towers are overwhelmed? We know that this happens in many cases when there is a crisis. So what alternative kind of forms of communication, what other technologies can we employ? What if internet access is interrupted? That's also very common. So do we have two-way radios? Do we have other ways of getting messaging out to the community? And in all things school safety, culture is key. We have to be thinking about culturally specific norms when it comes to reunification and managing this process. What are the norms around guardianship? Are there aunts and uncles? Is there extended family that we can expect showing up with parents? Is it a large family that we need to think about planning for in our community to come and receive students and caregivers? Think too about, emotions. Culturally, how we express our emotions can be very unique. In some communities and some cultures, it can be really loud. It can be, a very emotional kind of experience, of course. And then in other communities, it can be very reserved. And when you have a multicultural community, we have to consider that sometimes those cultural norms can clash as we're considering how to best support individuals in the community. So don't forget to think about the unique cultures that are part of your community's culture. We also, of course, are moving a lot of people in this process. The whole process is really about moving and transporting people and students ultimately. So it's important that we consider a few really key considerations. One is that schools are responsible for the entire chain of custody from the beginning to the end, getting students and family members or caregivers reunited. So we have to be able to account for every single step of that process, maintaining the chain of custody, whether that involves transporting a student to the hospital, to the police station, handing that student off to a guardian. Also thinking about supervising the staging, the transport, and the arrival. And there's a lot of different stops along the way in this process. So, for example, if we are moving students and staff with buses, with vehicles, we've got to be able to verify who is boarding those buses, who has left the building, who gets off that bus. So at every transition point that we have moved students and staff, we must stop and verify that we have all of the people that we thought we were supposed to have. We also want to be able to verify attendance as soon as we get to that off-site location. It's really easy in a very multi-step, confusing, emotional kind of process like this to lose sight of where someone may have been left behind. Someone may have been moved to another location. So we've got to be stopping and verifying attendance at every moving point. We also have to really carefully consider controlling access. And a perfect example of that is, again, the personal experience that many of us lived at Sandy Hook. We had all of our students and staff members moved to the nearby volunteer fire station. We also had parents showing up, community members showing up, all kinds of different law enforcement agencies and public safety professionals kind of amassing at this location. We also had the media in the mix. That fire station location really didn't have any type of restricted or controlled access for a very, very long time. That's going to be incredibly problematic in terms of who's coming, who's going, being able to account for all persons, which, as we know, is one of our essential functional annexes. We've got to think about moving vehicles. Many of us who live in school world, we know how very dangerous that school parking lot, that bus loop, that car loop can be. And anytime we've got moving vehicles, we've got to be especially careful. People are often in these circumstances a little confused, a little dazed, a little emotional, and so they're a little bit more at risk of stepping out in front of a moving vehicle. So this is a very serious risk that we cannot underestimate in this process. And then, of course, all along the way, we want to make sure that we are supervising, we are looking, monitoring for any medical or mental health support needs along the way. Reunification takes practice, that's for sure. And there's lots of different ways for us to practice. We can practice in a tabletop fashion with scenario cards and scenarios of potential students and staff members and circumstances. We can have the big full-scale practice annually, ideally. We can consider parent and student volunteers to help and run through the reunification practice, assigning roles even, an upset parent, an uncooperative parent or child, for example. So lots of different ways that we can exercise and practice and troubleshoot. There's no doubt to conduct a full-scale reunification and that practice is time-consuming. It is resource-intensive. And so for many schools and communities, it's not something they're able to pull off with multiple agencies and people on an annual basis. Annual should be our goal, but it is not possible in all cases. And if it is not, that doesn't mean that we can't practice in other ways. It can be just as valuable to talk through some of these scenarios, to kind of war game all of the different solutions that we might have for various problems that might come up. And of course, it's a great opportunity to get all of those different team members practicing, playing, communicating, and developing that kind of team culture and that cooperative, collaborative environment that's going to be essential to success. The annual review of reunification procedures is also really important to this whole process. We want to make sure that we have identified who that team is, who are the backups. We want to know what are the potential reunification sites on and off campus, alternatives. Are they still available to us? Has something changed? Has ownership changed? These things are important for us to be reviewing annually. We also, of course, annually and really even multiple times during the year need to be updating class rosters and emergency cards in kits and systems. The ideal is for us to have a cloud-based system if possible. I know that's not possible in every school and community, so manual works well too, with frequent manual updates on pencil and paper. But in a cloud-based system, we do have the unique capability of making changes that are immediately populated throughout the system that multiple people can access from various points in the area. And then, of course, we want to continually, at least annually, locate, check, and restock those reunification kits and supplies. So it's a lot to think about. reunifying our kids, reunifying our community members after there has been a crisis. But the goal of reunification should be putting our community back together. In many cases, how well we reunify our students and our staff with their caregivers, with their families, can mean everything. It can mean the start of recovery. Thanks for joining me.